Anything you want to say to PSPP if he's watching this?
No,
Not at all.
I don't want to speak to him.
Okay. Next
Just
time.
retire.
Yeah, there you go.
Get a different job, you know?
Hello there, everyone. My name is Colton Dadzipa. I'm the host of Metropolis, and I'm here today with guest Ted Rutland, associate professor at the Geography, Planning, and Environment Department at Concordia, and also the co-author of a book called Out to Defend Ourselves, A History of Montreal's First Haitian Street Gang. Thank you for coming on, Ted.
Thanks for having me.
So I have Ted here today to talk about a recent op-ed that he put out in The Rover, a sister publication of ours. We always like the stuff they put out. This piece is titled Ethnic Criminality or White Anxiety. And this piece was sort of published after some comments made by Parti Québécois leader Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, where he implied that immigration, young ethnic youth, are the sort of source of the rising crime in Montreal. Is that right?
Is that right that was his claim right, or is that what the article was about?
Is that what the article is about? Just generally?
Yeah, I mean, so he makes this claim. Well, I mean, I guess it starts with Journal de Montréal and Québécois doing this sort of pseudo-investigation in which they find that 1/3 of murders in Montreal involved a person under the age of 21. They played with the numbers a little bit to make that number seem very big.
Right.
Most people understand that a murder involves at least two people. So if a youth is involved, that means that they're the author or the victim in more like 1/6 of murders this year, which is like kind of what you'd expect. It's unfortunate that we have murders at all. But, you know, violent crime tends towards younger people in the age spectrum. And so it's not unusual for that to happen. He takes this Québécois investigation, which did not mention race or immigration, but did feature a lot of photographs of people with darker skin for whatever reason, and uses this occasion to spread a bunch of unfounded and xenophobic and racist opinions about how, quote unquote, demographic changes have led to a kind of violence that we've never seen before and methods we've never seen before. And, you know, talked about crime happening on an ethnic basis. And what I tried to do in the piece for The Rover was just to trace the history of those kinds of claims, which I argue became very prominent in the 1980s and have since become kind of normalized. Like you can just sort of say that as if that's a sensible or intelligent thing to say.
It's been said enough that it's sort of entered like just kind of public consciousness.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I think is interesting about one of the things you point out is that like these kinds of like claim, or specifically the thing about PSPP, the leader of the PQ, talking about or pointing at Europe, right, as a sort of like Quebec risks becoming what Europe is right now, right, with this kind of like, and if you look at like French news specifically, like French right-wing news, a lot of it is kind of like all this like hubbub about crime and delinquency and this kind of like thing that gets in the way of safety. And of course, and as is often with these kinds of right-wing opinions, it's always pointed at the immigrants, as it were. I'm kind of curious about like, I guess were you surprised at those kinds of comments when PSPP made that sort of leap from the report? I'm wondering how you received that kind of.
It doesn't surprise me at all coming from him. In terms of referring to Europe, I'll say that we've seen that frequently since the 1980s as well, or even earlier. But it's not always Europe. So often, and especially since 2020, we've seen more references to Toronto and Chicago, which is a code word for black.
Of course.
So we're blaming crime on black people in Montreal. When they point to Europe, they usually mean Arabs.
Right.
And one of the not surprising things in the last 22, 23 months, just to put a number on it, is there's been an increasing attention to the problem of Arabs in Montreal. The so-called problem of Arabs. And so this begins with the École Bedford scandal of Arab and Muslim teachers who actually did some inappropriate things but inappropriate things happen in many schools. A sort of scandal about some things that were happening at this school, it being blamed on Muslims, even though there were other Muslim teachers who were contesting this. And it's basically just a poorly managed problem in a school, which there are in many schools in Quebec. This one happened to be a problem involving a couple of Arab and Muslim teachers, so this becomes the media story. Then we have a sort of moral panic about a gang called Arab Power, with Radio-Canada putting out a map of Montreal divided into gang territories. And Arab Power supposedly controls about a quarter of the city, including like Petit Patrie, the Plateau, downtown, the Old Port, Hochelaga. And this is obviously not true. If a very small gang called Arab Power took that much control, they would get a knock on the door from the Hells Angels and the Mafia, and they would quickly be put in their place. And then you have Fadi Daguerre saying, our police chief saying, like, if we don't act now with these issues of youth violence, we're going to end up like Marseille. And Marseille is a code word for Arab.
Of course.
So to me, this is like symptomatic in a time when white people, white countries are supporting Israel's genocide against Arab and Muslim people, and round the clock sort of support for this horrific level of violence that we are supposed to believe that Arabs are a source of violence to us. So I think we need to look at the sort of material conditions that lead to these kinds of statements. In terms of Pierre Plamondon saying these things, I mean, it is a feature of right-wing nationalism, ethno-nationalism. And the PQ is a centrist party on some things. They're a right-wing party on other things. But the primary thing among both the PQ and the CAQ is that they have nothing to offer the average person. Their party's committed to just increasing wealth for the rich. And the suffering of people under these governments is widening. And so the average like white Québécois de souche person is not better under these governments either. I mean, people are being pushed, like evicted and pushed into the river, pushed into the street, regardless of their ethnic background. It's probably disproportionately people of color. But in a province where the majority of the population is white, it's mostly white people who are actually numerically who are getting evicted, and the PQ and the CAQ have nothing to offer. They have no plans to remedy the housing crisis, and so all you can offer is fear of the other. Whether we're talking about the school system, the health system, the housing market, or violence. If you were to actually recognize that violence is a problem in all communities, you might be forced to actually deal with it rather than just whipping up fear and throwing more money at the police.
Right. It seems I guess it's an easy mobilizing force, right, for these parties that are supported by mostly white Québécois. I think it's really interesting that you bring up this thing about how the actual, like specifically with this one case with these Arab teachers, it's their behavior, of course, it's like problematic and troublesome. It's not necessarily outside the norm, or maybe not the norm necessarily, but it's not outside of whatever like rate of frequency, right, among schools, among even white teachers. But because of their Arab identities, it becomes this kind of issue that's kind of like it's not just. It no longer becomes just a local issue of like administration, poor management at the school. It becomes this thing about like immigration, having these people who are different than us. And it becomes this easy thing for people to like, I guess, just point at and fearmonger about. I guess what I really like about your piece, I guess, is the history you kind of go into, right? Because this has to do with your research on kind of like street gangs and kind of different kinds of, I guess, criminality, as it were, in Montreal. So there is this thing about that we're starting to talk about, I guess, about what is the history of like criminality in Montreal, right? Because there's this thing we go to way back to the 80s, right, where you're saying this thing starts to emerge about like this kind of conversation. Specifically, one thing I thought was really interesting in your piece was this statement put out by the lawyer for the police union. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, in the 1980s in Montreal, you start to see a series of major social changes that would characterize any large city in Canada and many large cities in the global north, which is you have this horrific economic crisis. And so the unemployment rate, rises to about 15% in the late 70s in Montreal and stays above 10% into the late 90s. And so, factories are closing down, warehouses are closing, neighborhoods like Saint-Henri and Hochelaga are seeing incredible devastation as Montreal makes this very painful transition from an industrial economy to a services-based economy. You also see, demographic changes. What Saint Paul Plamondon would call demographic changes. I mean it in a different way, but Canada's immigration policies changed in the 1960s, and so you start to have more migrants from the global south. That starts to change the cities into the multicultural kind of cities that we know today. And one of the things that's going on, and I would name as a third kind of crisis, but it's a crisis for white supremacy and the police, is that you have a growing Black-led movement against police violence in Montreal, which is growing from the late 70s through the 80s, but really escalates after the killing of a non-armed Black teenager named Anthony Griffin in 1987. So you have these huge protests. And eventually the police chief fires the cop who killed Anthony Griffin. It's the first time and only time that a police officer has been fired for killing anyone. And so the police brotherhood, police union, mounts this pressure campaign against the police chief. And they are aided in that through their alliance with the growing far right in Quebec. And so through the 1980s, you have growth of racist skinhead movements as well as far right neo-fascist groups. And this is, across North America and across the global north phenomena. I mean, also in the parts of the global south, like India. But they become allied, and they adopt this incredibly, xenophobic perspective that we have too many immigrants, we should have no immigrants, and that immigrants, because of their cultural difference, will create disorder. Right. They will create conflict, and so they'll create crime.
It's like just their base kind of lean is towards crime and like chaos.
Yeah.
That's the assumption.
And so the police brotherhood takes up this argument in their campaign against the police chief who had fired one of their members, and to push back against the Black-led movement against police violence. And so they, in this what I quoted from was a letter from the lawyer of the police brotherhood that was published in La Presse, like it was a legit thing, which is one of the most racist things I've seen published in La Presse ever.
I was taken aback by it, just how like blatant it was.
He didn't admit that he was the lawyer of the police brotherhood. That came out later. Okay. But I knew the name because he'd been defending the cop who was fired. Saying basically like, I've had enough. The silent majority has had enough. Silent majority has had enough of these immigrants who come and treat this like it's their place, implant their culture here. I'm sick of Black people who are destroying our neighborhoods, blah, 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 blah. But that's just one letter. I mean, the police brotherhood was campaigning around this. They submitted, like a major submission to a public inquiry about this, and they're mouthing word for word the same perspective as far right groups, and then all of these groups start to get a lot of mainstream attention in 1989, where the far right is saying things that are pretty similar to more mainstream ethno-nationalists. There's a documentary that was broadcast on Radio-Canada called Disparaître, so disappearance, all about the declining white Québécois birth rate and how they might disappear, and the problems that'll create. And the birth rate was declining. The number of Québécois de souche is going to decline, and there are going to be more people who aren't of that background in the province. But they give central place to all these fascists who are talking about, that this is going to lead to violence, it's going to lead to conflict, etc.
Race wars.
Exactly. And, to say like disparaître, there's going to be more immigrants. I mean, you're just saying great replacement. They didn't say great replacement at the time, but that's what it is.
Effectively, it's
and
the
this
same
is on
concept.
Radio-Canada in a documentary sort of hosted by Lise Payette, who was very, an important member of the Parti Québécois, as well as a columnist for Le Devoir forever. So very mainstream figure. Yeah, and so they're promoting the idea that cultural difference leads to criminality, violence, and disorder. And of course, there's no evidence of that at all.
There's so much here to talk about, right? Because I mean, even with this stuff about the race replacements theory, that's being this huge mainstay, right, in these kinds of like far right circles all across like the world, right? Like I'm happy you mentioned it, but um, what I think is interesting about PSPP saying this and this kind of showing the history of this, I guess, this strain of far right kind of like ideology here in Quebec and how it's kind of taken hold. One of the things I want to ask to you is like, you know, as someone who's kind of seen the trajectory of this kind of ideology, of these kinds of ideas, why is it, do you think, that it was able to take such a hold, and why do you think it's able to be spouted by the leader of a party that is, if the elections were held today, would become the premier with a majority government? Why do you think these ideas are so popular right now and have been allowed to become popular?
I mean, I think the conditions in the late 80s are really similar to the conditions now, where you're seeing, you know, a grave kind of economic and social crisis that is affecting a lot of people. I mean, capitalism is a crisis for the working class and for the poor at all times, you know. But there are moments that we call crises. The mainstream calls a crisis where it's starting to affect middle class people as well.
Right. Yeah.
And so in the 1980s, it was unemployment for the most part. Declining standards of living in relation, especially with a rising inflation. Now it's primarily expressed in relation to housing. You know, it's just, you know, everyday people who grew up in middle class households now are like, oh, I was told I was going to be able to buy a house, and now I can't.
The security that was thought was there is no longer.
That's the middle class crisis. Is like there's an expectation that you'll be a homeowner, and it's, you know, becoming less and less of a reality. And then if you are a homeowner, I mean, your mortgage payments are very expensive. It's high, it's you know, it's a challenge to live. And then for working class and poor people, I mean, the housing crisis is like being evicted, being on the street, or, you know, living in a terrible apartment that isn't up to standard. And so in both cases, you've got grave social problems that nobody has any intention to address in the mainstream. You know, the PQ is not planning to address this in any way. That would mean sort of, you know, a class politics where you're going to, you know, take some power and or resources from the powerful, from the wealthy, and redistribute them, you know, in whatever way. That also could just be like, you know, a rent freeze. It could be taxing the rich and building public housing. But in any way that you do it, you're talking about a redistribution of income and power, and they have no intention to do that. And people are suffering. So what do you offer people? What do you sell people on? You could sell people on, we're going to fix the housing crisis, and here's our plan to solve it. You know, you could sell people on the idea that like the climate crisis is going to get worse and worse. You know how you can barely breathe the air in Montreal in the summer? We're going to fix that, and here's our plan to do it. They're not going to do that. Scapegoating immigrants is it's free. Like, it doesn't cost you anything,
Right?
Because no one's good. I mean, well, PSPP is promising to throw more money at the police, so it does cost you something. But that's a very easy use of public money to sell, you know. So I think that the conditions are very similar, and they're similar in the sense of there's rising fascism in both contexts.
Right.
And so PSPP is not a fascist, neither is François Legault, but they are picking up, you know, slightly more mainstream versions of far-right ideas, and they gain strength. Like the far-right loves François Legault.
Right.
He's not a far-right person, but they see him as someone who, you know, is on their side and doing the same things that they want. And, you know, you also have, it's fading a little bit now, but you do have the police brotherhood again and the police department. It's fading because in 2020 we had a broad-based Black Lives Matter and Defund the Police movement, which carried into 2021 and still exists, but it isn't, you know, threatening power in the same way that it was in 2020 and 2021. And so there's a need on the behalf of the Brotherhood to protect their people, which means, you know, ensure that no one ever gets fired. Definitely ensure that there's no defunding of the police.
Right.
And so they've been very helpful in manufacturing consent for more police resources. And I would say there that it's just way easier to scare people about people of color as violent people than it is white people, just because that's the whole basis of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery is like you attribute violence onto indigenous people, black people, other people of color, and so it's just way easier to
But
scare.
when white people do it, it's like sort of necessary, or it's sort of
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
yeah,
No, the
right,
white
right.
people are the most violent people in history, you know,
yeah,
but
yeah.
you're not going to hear people say that in the mainstream.
Because it serves order or whatever it might be in the.
There's
the
always a
kind
justification
Right,
for
of
it, right?
course,
Like
of
Israel's
course.
just defending itself. The police are just, defending neighborhoods.
Right, yeah.
Apparently, I guess, like, well, the way that the police and mainstream commentators described racist skinheads in the 80s, they said, yeah, it's a problem, but like they're responding to the criminality of the people of color. So we have to just, if we can repress them, then
these
the skins
skinheads-
will disappear.
Right.
So there's never a reason to like use massive police resources against white people. Not that I think that we should. I think that there are non-police solutions to all these things.
No, of course. I think it's really interesting to see these kinds of like I don't know what you would call it, maybe like allyship, right, between these kind of right wing forces and police, because you see that, like you were saying before, it's a trend across the global north as well as the global south, right, in India as well. I want to ask, what do you think it is that makes institutions like Montreal's police so close to these people who are spouting this kind of hateful ideology?
Well, I mean, police forces are inherently conservative forces at the best of times. They are institutions that are the primary protectors of white supremacy and the worst kinds of masculinity. They're the institution that promotes the kind of toxic masculinity that some men end up taking up. It's like, where's it coming from? It's not coming not only from video games and movies. It's coming from this police force that is in our.
What do you think constitutes that this idea, this like toxic form of masculinity?
No demonstration of emotion, no kind of sympathy. Respond to any threat,
tough call.
threat, any kind of verbal or physical threat with more violence. That's the only way to do it. And so it is that. It also is an institution based on punishing individuals for what are ultimately social problems. And so whatever the problem is, and there are some of the things we call crime are real problems, but they're caused by social issues, not individuals. And so, but the response to every single infraction is punish that individual, which is an inherently right-wing position. And then, so what leads them to be fascist? I don't know whether police departments themselves should be characterized as fascist, but police unions or police brotherhoods most often are, because what they want is they want a police force that is accountable to no one, where no cop ever faces consequences for what they do, where police are celebrated no matter what they do. They don't like police chiefs telling cops what to do. They don't like politicians telling police what to do. They don't like, Black-led or Indigenous-led or queer-led social movements. They don't want any of that. They don't want any constraints on police power. So that's as fascist as it gets.
Right.
So we have in every major city an organization, a police brotherhood, that is a fascist organization that has incredible resources, because they're getting dues from police officers, and they have nothing to do all day. They have many things to do all day, but one of the things that they can do is constantly be talking to the media and feeding them stories, leaking them stories,
creating this idea of that kind of danger that only they can deal with.
Yeah. And so they have, they're treated as a legitimate source by the media. It's incredible.
Yeah. Anything they say is
like if David Duke, showed up in Montreal, he wouldn't be interviewed like an old KKK person, right? Yeah. He presumably wouldn't be interviewed by the mainstream media every day about what to do about crime.
Until so many years have passed and other people are saying his points. And
exactly. But the Police Brotherhood, they're treated as a legit source.
Yeah, I want to go back to this. Before, when I was asking about this, I guess the kind of like material, we're talking about the material context, right? That kind of lead to these kinds of things. Before we were talking about the 80s, you're saying there's a kind of a similarity between the, let's say, 80s economic crisis and this current crisis we're in now. These crises, of course, being sort of, I think, between you and I, being fundamental to capitalism and just kind of part and parcel of it. When I think of the 80s, I think of specifically in movies, right? That's sort of my kind of windows because I was born after the 80s, but I'm so often this picture of like urban decay, right? I think of like you think of urban decay, you think of like inner city crime, you know, like specifically the image that comes to mind is like, you know, like a New York subway that's just completely graffiti, you know. And of course this wasn't only in New York, like we're saying, this is happening in like many major cities because of this economic crisis that was happening across the global north. And I think to draw parallels to today, and being in this certain kind of crises, and I think what we're trying to get at is these crises are the things that create this category of events that we call criminality, right, and crime, and people, let's say, like breaking laws and having to steal or potentially leading to gangs. I guess to get into like the nitty gritty of it, what is it that you think, like, of course in this context, economic context of like poverty and the difficulties of actually like getting access to resources and social services. What is it about that leads people to crime or to, let's say, like delinquency, as it were?
Well, so it's a complicated issue, right?
Yeah.
Because we define delinquency essentially as deviation from our norm. It doesn't even necessarily mean crime, but it can include crime. So what causes people to deviate from a norm? It's like, well, that's actually a pretty common thing. You know, it's kind of weird that's
how the norm works.
It's kind of weird that people are normal.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. What is a normal person?
like producing a bunch of people who adhere to norms takes work, because it's not normal for people to all behave the same.
Right.
So in some sense, it's like delinquency is just a normal thing that happens. Well, so then we can easily say, you know, based on common sense, but also research, that one of the things that leads people to not commit delinquent acts is giving them a sense that they have a stake in the system. You know, so if you if you were treated well in school, treated like someone who has a future, and told that like if you keep it up and you'll like, get to be a lawyer or a doctor, or get to be on TV or whatever, then you have a stake in the system and you'll follow its rules. You know, this is what research shows. It's also like, I remember having this thought in my own head, you know, you don't become a university professor if you're not a bit of a nerd in school and appreciated by some of your teachers. And that became a deterrent for me when, like, you know, I got it, you know, whatever. We all get up to some stuff, but
cut that out.
But, you know, I remember being like, if I do too much of this, like, I'm going to throw away this future that I have, you know? And everyone can have a future, but I mean, A, we could create a world where everyone has a future. B, we could tell people that they have a future that and do that on a basis that isn't shaped by class and race, which is the way we really do it right now. Like my teachers telling me I had a future also had a lot to do with being white.
Right. Exactly.
So you know, we need to create a world where people have a stake in the society and can see a future within the society. So conversely, you know, what research would show in terms of delinquency is that people get involved in delinquency on a more sustained basis because of struggles in their lives. School is hard for them. They're having issues with their peers. They're having a problem at home. A lot of that can have to do with poverty. And, you know, some of the research that I traced in this piece for the Rover is that there was a really great Haitian academic who worked for the Université de Montreal who was called to examine cases of delinquency among Haitian youth because the youth tribunal was like, we don't understand these kids. We need a Haitian to explain these kids. And it's like, you know, it's not the worst thing. I mean, it's a weird thing to ask, but it's also, you know, maybe useful. Sure. But what he found was, you know, that Haitian kids misbehaved at the same rate as all the other youth, and they misbehaved for reasons of challenges in their lives. And some of the challenges that they faced had to do with the specificities of their lives, like experiencing immigration. You know, maybe one of their parents is still in Haiti, one of them's here, or whatever. And so, you know, there's specificities in everyone's lives. If we enlarge the view to a group, some of those specificities will be particular to their group.
Sure.
So there was like a characteristic. One of the reasons that Haitian students were were getting involved in delinquency had to do with their particular experience as immigrants, as Haitian, as Black, but that you could look at like white youth and you'd find some particularities too.
Sure.
So the basic argument is just that, you know, people will get involved in delinquency on a sustained basis because of challenges that they're facing, and those challenges may have something to do with their particularities, and most often they don't either. And if you wanted to address them, you'd have to look at the challenges, not throw more money at the police.
Right. Yeah. Convenient for the police.
Yeah.
Everything needs more money for them.
Yeah, you know, and there are great organizations. I often talk about Café Jeunesse Multiculturelle de Montréal Nord that works with youth of all backgrounds and all social classes, but they end up working mostly with youth who are struggling, so who are coming from racialized communities and poorer communities, because being poor involves more challenges than not being poor, and being a person of color in a racist society can create more challenges than not. But they're just in these kids' lives. Some of them are young adults, I shouldn't say kids, but they're in these youth lives. They're providing support, they're providing mentorship, and they're helping youth to achieve the goals that they define. So they're not telling youth to like abide by a norm.
Right.
They're like, what do you need?
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
what are you trying to do? What are your struggles in school? And they would say that, you know, there's been a lot of focus on violence in schools, gangs in schools, and this organization that works with youth, they're like, the people who are involved in really problematic stuff aren't in school.
Right.
They dropped out of school, or they were expelled from school, and that's why they have a lot of time to get involved with some other stuff, you know.
Right.
And so
the goal should be keeping them in school, not necessarily give them more money.
Address their challenges that are leading them to drop out of school, and if they do end up outside of school, then like, how are you going to support this person to either get back in school, or to get some kind of job, or address whatever challenges they were facing that might have been non-academic challenges that led them to not be in school anymore. Again, like throwing more money at the police isn't going to do anything.
Right. I mean, the only thing that really serves is like it creates. I feel like specifically this thing we're talking about, like throwing more money at the police to sort of try to attempt to solve these issues of like delinquency and crime. And all it does is really, I feel, create whatever momentary sense of safety for like whatever like this kind of white supremacist ideology, right? It's like there's nothing that's really solved by. I remember during the federal elections this year, there's like a lot of talk by the conservatives, as there was about like increasing like mandatory minimums, right? Increasing punishments, but like for the most part, any kind of organization that deals with like youth who are sort of experiencing delinquency or who might be on the edges of crime, none of them are asking for like mandatory minimums, right? Because they have the understanding that punishment doesn't necessarily solve the issue.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and in terms, you mentioned ideas of urban decay in the 70s and 80s. I mean, the Polyev conservatives really played on that. Their whole thing was that like, you know, Vancouver's broken, Canada's broken, and they had no chance of getting votes, you know, in the central part of Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal. They're playing to people in the suburbs and people in smaller cities. Right. And so, it's very easy to get people who don't live in cities to think that like graffiti is a really terrifying thing, of course, or that drug use can be solved by just like sending people to prison or mandatory abstinence programs. You know, like it's the people least affected by the problem that are can be most riled up by it.
Right. I think there's something interesting there, right? Where like when we think about like smaller towns and suburbs, which are often usually white, not always. I think that's sort of shifting nowadays. But I think there's something interesting at play there, right? Where the demographics rather of these kinds of suburbs and smaller towns are often like very like white, right? And then you point to the place where there is like urban areas where there's a lot of immigrants and also drug use and like let's say homelessness, and then like I guess it's easy to make the connection to those people in the smaller towns that hey, guess what, all these things are linked. You know, it's because that there's more immigrants and there's drug use and this thing, it's a whole terrible package that we need to protect the small towns from, right?
It's a whole package of threats. And you know, the CAQ is one representative on the island of Montreal. We're governed
up really at Point de l'Île.
The very, very edge of it, right? And
they got just a toe in.
So, you know, if you're trying to scare people about Muslims, like this stuff about like Sharia law and whatever, like nobody who lives in Montreal think that that's happening, you know? Like Haroon Bouazi is going to install Sharia law. He can't even install socialism. He's a member of Quebec Solidaire, can't install socialism, and there'd be far more support for socialism than Sharia law. But if you live in Montreal, you find that laughable.
Of course, yeah.
But I guess if you live in Beauce, like I don't know people in Beauce, but like presumably people who are voting for the CAQ find this more believable because they don't encounter people.
Right, yeah.
They just hear these things and it seems believable to them.
Stories.
And
They get fed all the stories of crimes and murders happening in Montreal.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think speaking of the CAC, I think there's something interesting that I think connects to what you were saying before about like how to keep, let's say, like youth or like really anyone out of delinquency, out of this thing like we imagine as crime, is giving them opportunities, right? Making sure that they see these potentials in the future. And for me, to ask the question is like, do you think something like Law 21 affects that the ability of youth to see futures in themselves? Because for me, when we were talking about this, I was like, oh, it's interesting because we have Law 21, right, which was prohibited people who work public-facing jobs in the government from having any kind of like religious, was it ostentatious religious ornament on them, right?
Hijab.
yeah, exactly. Well, they meant hijab, they meant like kippas.
Right. They included a bunch of other things.
Yeah, like a cross, but it's like, I mean, when you think about like when people practice religions, it's predominantly going to be affecting like women who wear hijabs, right? And then you had teachers who had to step down, right? And now I think about this situation, it's like now you have this school that no longer has maybe they still have Muslim teachers, but they no longer have a woman who's wearing a hijab as a teacher, and that's one person who's taken away from that, who could have potentially been a role model for a young Muslim kid. They could have been someone who's supporting someone at the school throughout their like adolescence and childhood, and showing them, oh, there is a way for you, and you take that support away, and then at the same time you create fear about this rising kind of delinquency, which of course, as you're stating, is sort of like disproportionately represented, right? I don't know. I guess I want to talk a bit about that and how other ways you think Bill 21 kind of affects this kind of like I guess cyclical the cyclical nature of this.
Yeah, well, like the fascist sort of line would be something like, it'd be the great replacement, like they're replacing us, or they'd be like, it's not our country anymore. Well, what's Bill 21? It's a way of saying like, this is our country.
Right.
It's clearly what that is. It's establishing that like secular white Quebecois culture is the culture of this place. And that's, sadly quite popular among white Quebecois voters. But the message that it's sending to everyone else is this isn't your place. So like on a practical level, your example of the teacher is exactly right. But this society is also telling you that this isn't your place.
Right.
And, they sort of want the message to be that if you like just quote unquote integrate and like stop wearing the hijab, then you'll be included. But I don't think anyone's really fooled by that. It's a clear message that like you people don't belong here. This is our place. And I don't think that leads to delinquency, but it certainly can be one of the reasons that people might have. A white person might feel excluded from the society for a different reason. But it's no way to build like a decent society, very obviously, right? And I think Montreal, on the average day demonstrates, another way of living where there's a diversity of every kind in this city, in terms of like race and ethnicity, sexuality, age, like just interests. And it's working pretty well for the most part.
Yeah.
If we could get a better provincial government, a better municipal government as well, maybe that would it could be even better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's talk real quick about. We have two elections coming up. One is a little much more immediate. The next municipal elections. I'm kind of wondering how you are, if you're paying attention to it. What you're seeing that maybe is a little more hopeful, right? Because we're talking before about like things like the police brotherhood, the police unions here in Montreal, and the police in general having this sort of wall of like, we don't take shit from no one, we decide the budget for ourselves. We're not going to let anyone tell us anything. But I'm kind of curious what you're looking for in this next municipal election coming up with regards to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, two of the most important municipal issues in terms of social and racial justice are housing, which includes homelessness, and the police. And we've been living for the last 8 years under Projet Montréal, which manages to capture the left-wing and progressive vote despite not being a progressive or left-wing party. And when they're challenged on issues that they don't care about, because issues, when they're challenged from the right on issues that they don't care about, like the police, like homelessness, they'll just adopt the right's position. And so in the last election campaign in 2021, Ensemble Montréal, under Denis Coderre, said, there's a crime problem. We're going to add 500 more cops, or was it 250? 250 more cops. And Projet Montréal just said, we'll do that too.
Yeah.
And there was no basis for the idea that we needed 250 more cops. But like Projet Montréal doesn't care about the people who are harmed by the police, so it's nothing for them. They're just gonna. They've got some good policies on some things, right? But when it comes to things involving people they don't care about, their policies are very right wing. And so for me, this is a very depressing situation where you have a party like Projet Montréal that captures the left wing and progressive votes, even though they're not a progressive or left wing party. And then we have Ensemble Montréal, which is a more right wing party, and also it's a suburban based party. So they are going to be more car friendly. They're going to be more, not caring so much about housing issues in the central city. And they would normally be even worse on homelessness because like the sight of people in the streets is very upsetting for people who come from the suburbs. Whereas you live in the city, like it's upsetting to you on a social justice level, but like you're used to living around a diversity of people, so it doesn't bother you in the same way.
It's not like an aesthetic offense, right?
Yeah, exactly. But they do have one member of their party, Ensemble Montréal, Benoît Langevin, who used to run a homeless shelter. So they're actually better than Projet Montréal on homelessness. So what is exciting to me is that this year we'll have a strong left-wing party in the campaign, Transition Montréal, headed by Craig Sauvé, who to me is the best city councilor we have right now, a former Projet Montréal person, very in the mold of NDP. He's run for the NDP a few times. He was with the NDP before he went into municipal politics. So he's that kind of, progressive left-wing person. Not as left-wing as I would like, but if he were, he would have no chance of winning. Right. So he's making his politics are the best I think we can hope for right now. And he has been on the right side of many issues since he left Projet Montréal right before the last election. So he's trying to gather people around him for an agenda that will be distinctly left-wing, that will, so far is promising, to increase taxes on the very wealthy and use that to fund services for unhoused people. So that obviously is a good thing. He hasn't revealed much on policing yet, but I'm optimistic. He's someone that I've had conversations with a lot, and he's spoken out against police budget increases. He spoke out against the closing of a safe consumption site in St. Henry. So like, he's going to be a left-wing voice in this election. And, I'm terrible at predicting the result of elections, so I don't know. What I feel hopeful about is just that there's a left-wing voice in the campaign, that Projet Montréal will have a left-wing challenger. And so even if they don't elect anyone, which, I think they'll certainly get a bunch of people elected. Certainly. I said I don't know how to predict elections. Even if they don't get anyone elected, their presence in the campaign will be a positive thing. In the same way that, when the Liberals rule our government at the federal level, they're a better government because the NDP exists.
Right. Because the conversation gets to be at least like not just pulled from the right, balls from the left. Exactly.
Sometimes the NDP like accuses Liberals of stealing their policies, and it's like good, If left-wing ideas are getting implemented, this is a good thing, no matter who's doing it.
That's what we're after.
Yeah.
I think we're running a little low on time, but to get onto the topic of the second, much more distant election, but I think very, very much looming with quite a big shift, I think, underway, or at least being projected right now with the PQ in the lead. The provincial elections next year in 2026. I mean, you had your article kind of addressed to Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, but I guess what would you imagine would happen if the PQ wins the election with a majority government with the way things are set now?
Well, I don't know how much would change really, because I mean it's hard for me to understand. I'll admit that I thought the PQ was done when the CAQ was created, and they managed to combine the PQ's nationalism without the sovereignty, because sovereignty is not a very popular policy, right? And it's going to be very unpopular among the business community. It's going to be unpopular among Anglophones, and it's not a majority supported policy among like white Quebecers either. So I thought when the CAQ managed to pick up their identity politics without the sovereignty, I thought the PQ was done,
Right.
and
I mean,
they were for a while.
seats, right?
They were for a while, you know.
Yeah.
But somehow they have risen from the ashes. I don't exactly know why. I mean, I think it's mostly displeasure with the CAQ. It's a little bit hard to see how they'll be any different. On identity issues, they seem to have the same policies.
Right, it's the same playbook.
But the thing is like, they're not any more willing to address the real issues facing people. So they're just going to have to hammer away at the immigration issue, at communities of color, which, the primary way you do that is around crime. So he's already talking about throwing more money at the police. So it looks quite bleak to me. The closest challenger right now is the Liberal Party, which is a terrible party in so many ways. Like some of your viewers will remember 2012 when we were in the streets protesting Jean Charest, and they're a right-wing party. They're less identitarian, and so they're less overtly racist, but their policies are really bad for like everyday people of all backgrounds. And liberalism in Canada and around the world is having a real tough time right now because liberals don't want to solve any issues. People's lives are getting worse, and they don't have either like the right kind of demonization of the other to get them elected, or the left's policy of like, we're going to actually make things better.
Right.
So, I don't know how the Liberals were going to operate in this climate. They're a very successful party historically in Quebec. But again, they don't see any willingness on their part to actually address real problems. They'll seem like a better option for people who want to push back on the identity agenda of the PQ. And it creates a less soul-destroying mental environment when the Liberals are in power, because they're just not so horrendous in the way they speak, but they're social.
It's not a total free fall.
But they're so they're not constantly espousing racism, but their policies are really bad for everybody, including people of color. So it's just like it's just like you don't have to see the racism being spoken, but their policies are just as harmful.
Right.
So it looks pretty bleak. I mean, obviously, Quebec Solidaire could do something, but I don't know. I hope they do. They seem to be very much in disarray, and their support is very low, despite the fact that I think their platform is like very popular. They're talking about a wealth tax, which would tax a little bit more of the top 10% of the population, and is supported by 90% of the population, because 90% of the population isn't rich.
No, exactly.
So very obvious like policy to campaign on. But the media just tears them to bits on this.
Right.
It's not looking good, but lots can happen in a year, and
I was just about to say that.
And the thing that gives me hope always is just like everyday people organizing, and I think there's been a lot of really good organizing in the last couple of years. Obviously, especially around Palestine, and but to me that's a movement that is primarily about Palestine, but is also about everything. People will say that Palestine is the center of a struggle for global justice, and I believe that. And so it's also a place where people are building relationships, spreading ideas, and building power for a better world. There's been a kind of revival of a very beautiful kind of LGBTQ movement that's pushing back against the sort of mainstream sort of agenda. Very beautiful to see that. I mean, that's always been there, but it's coming back in a strong way, I think.
Our last episode was just on that.
That's very hopeful.
And, Wild Pride.
There's new forms of tenant struggle that I think are building, addressing some of the limitations of the historically quite strong tenants movement. So a lot can happen in a year, including just actions that change things on the ground without affecting the election. But this work also does impact elections, and so I don't have any hope for the PQ adopting a better platform. I don't have a ton of hope for for Quebec Solidaire. But if there's a strong,
polling
if
last
there's
right
strong
now.
movements,
Yeah.
those can lead to more support for Quebec Solidaire, who can then ideally, be the voice in the political system for the struggles in the streets and the neighborhoods.
Incredible. Well, thank you very much, Ted, for coming on, talking to us about this piece you wrote in The Rover. One thing I'd like to end on, is there anything you want to say to PSPP if he's watching this?
No,
Not at all.
I don't want to speak to him.
Okay. Next
Just
time.
retire.
Yeah, there you go.
Get a different job. He'd be a great. He'd be great at many things. He could be a cashier at a grocery store.
Yeah. I'm sure he'd be friendly.
Friendly enough. He's got an
yeah.
okay smile.
Yeah.
I would, give him my credit card for groceries. I'm sure he'd be fine.
Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. My name is Colin Dansipa. I'm the host of Metropolis, and today's guest was Ted Rutland, Associate Professor at the Geography, Planning, and Environment Department at Concordia, as well as one of the co-authors of a book called Out to Defend Ourselves, A History of Montreal's First Haitian Street Gang. Thank you very much, Ted.
Thanks a lot.
Take care, everyone.